How do you retake a church that's fallen to progressivism? Well, if they were able to change it one way, you can change it back. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where I build this big church in Minecraft while I talk about Christianity. And today I'm going to be telling you a story of my church, which briefly did fall to progressivism, but I'm going to tell you the story of how a bunch of guys, including me, were able to take it back. And it's not like my church is perfect now. It still has a lot of problems. It's a mainline Protestant church, which I'll go more into. But we've stopped it from completely falling to progressive Christianity. So, for those of you who don't really know the context, a lot of churches, particularly mainline Protestant churches, have abandoned the historic Christian faith and have instead fallen to what's called progressive Christianity, which seeks to just progress beyond the traditional historic Christian faith and just reinterpret it, say it's all just a metaphor for love and social justice, and they don't really believe in the Christian essentials. All they believe in is just being political and doing social justice. So, obviously, that is not Christianity, and if we are to actually be followers of Jesus, we need to stand against that. So, like I said, I always say this, I'm not talking about politically progressive. I'm not talking about politics at all, really. I'm just talking about churches that have abandoned what's historically been Christianity for a message that doesn't really have anything to do with Christianity, but just to do with politics and stuff. And that's the way a lot of progressive churches are. And the mainline Protestant denominations have, for the most part, fallen to this. Like the PCUSA, which is my denomination, and for Episcopals, the Episcopal Church in America, the United Methodist Church, which is now splitting over that whole issue, the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is not evangelical. So, yeah, all the mainline denominations have this problem, but the problem got as bad as it did because the more conservative Christians ran away as soon as it started becoming a problem, and that just accelerated their fall to progressive Christianity. So in some ways, they only really have themselves to blame, I think. But if you're wondering what I'm doing in Minecraft, I'm getting some jungle wood because I want to build an organ in my church. But I think that that was a mistake. It was a mistake to split from the mainline churches because they are the more culturally rooted institutional churches, and I think we need to take them back. So my church is a story of a somewhat successful attempt at taking back a church that had fallen to progressivism. So my church, just like 10 years ago, was considered a pretty conservative church, especially for the PCUSA. We were considered like the most conservative church in our presbytery. We had a pretty theologically conservative pastor. We had a lot of theologically and politically conservative members. This was way before I joined the church. Back then I wasn't religious. And more recently, in the past, 5 years or so, a lot of, the more conservative elders, the, old Scottish elders, all started dying out, so, they were replaced by younger people from the city that were much more progressive in their ideology. And the leadership just kind of didn't really notice this happening, didn't notice the gradual hijack. But the year I joined the church, I had 1 year with the pastor, and then he retired. And then my church did this thing where there was going to be a temporary 2-year interim pastor before we selected the permanent pastor. And because a bunch of progressives had crept onto the session of elders, the interim pastor that they selected was wildly progressive and did not believe the Christian faith at all. This is where I first got introduced to progressive Christianity. About a year after becoming Christian, I realized, hey, wait, there's a good number of people in these churches, of pastors, who don't believe Christianity. And at first I tried to see, maybe is there something to this progressive Christianity, because I was still exploring. But I ended up rejecting it because it did not provide anything spiritually substantial. It didn't provide anything that you couldn't get by listening to a Bernie Sanders rally, basically. I wanted actual answers about the big questions about God and religion and, all those other big questions that especially young people like me, are wondering about. So that's why I ended up rejecting progressive Christianity. And I was really concerned that this was the direction our church was going, because I didn't want this. So I was getting confirmed that year in the church, and I was assigned a mentor. And I asked him, like, I'm not sure if I'm into this whole progressive Christianity thing. Maybe I should leave and just join a more evangelical church. I heard about the PCA churches, and I live close to New York City, where all of Tim Keller and his daughter churches are. So I was like, hey, why shouldn't I just join one of those? And my mentor, who was still, theologically conservative, said that, that mindset is the reason this got so bad in the first place. He told me not to leave. He told me that our church, even though it was in the process of falling to progressivism, still has our book of confessions. Even though the PCUSA, for the most part, doesn't follow their confessions, they still have a book of confessions that has all the same Presbyterian confessions and other Reformed confessions, like the Presbyterian, like the Scots Confession, the Westminster Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism. So we are still Christian on paper, no matter what. It's just that a lot of people in the PCUSA have chosen not to follow our written beliefs. But he said, the PCUSA in its essence is still Christian, is still Reformed, is still Presbyterian, and our job should be to try and make it conform to its essence more. So me, him, and a bunch of other guys petitioned for our permanent pastor to be someone who actually has orthodox, lowercase o orthodox, it just means, correct, Reformed theology. And there were a lot of, uncomfortable arguments and fights within our church. So there was a lot of soul searching about what our church would be. But we didn't give up. And eventually, when the new pastor was selected, he was not like our interim pastor. He was not a progressive Christian. I don't agree with him on everything. He's definitely more theologically liberal than I am. But he believes the Christian faith. And what we did, I didn't do much. I wrote one letter. What the conservatives in my church did was they prevented my church from completely falling to progressivism, because we did have a pastor. She wanted us to fly a pride flag. She was a universalist. She did not believe in the resurrection, even. I should have mentioned that first. I don't know why I mentioned the pride flag thing first. This proves that we all are too influenced by politics, and theology needs to be first in our mind before what we think and say politically. But yeah, it was hard, but eventually we got our permanent pastor, who is theologically orthodox and has neglected to do things like fly a pride flag or other explicitly political things. And even though my church now is struggling, because once we had that interim pastor, a lot of people lost interest and left our church, and our church is just struggling with membership, as all mainline churches are, we did not fall to progressivism like so many other churches have. So how did we do it? How did we take a situation where we were about to and stop that from happening and become we are, I think, the one church in our region of PCUSA churches that does not fly a pride flag. So even though we're not a super conservative church, we are the most conservative church in our area. So how do we do it? Well, for one, we didn't run away. That's a big thing. A lot of it was surprising how quick and easy it was for the progressives to hijack our church. A lot of times when they do that, they can do it so quickly and easily because the conservatives either don't notice it's happening or just run away. So it took them 10 years to turn our church from a pretty conservative church to what was about to become one of those wild progressive churches. And I think it might have even been quicker than that. So it does not take long. So if they can do it, why can't we? I've started this thing on Instagram. I'm just calling it Operation Reconquista. I think that it should be our goal to retake the mainline Protestant churches, and I have another video explaining why. I'm not going to explain why in this video that much. I'll leave a link to that video in the description. Now, in that video I explained why, now I'm going to explain more how. But first I want to say, it was so easy for them to do it, so if we're going to say it's too hard for us to take them back, which is what a lot of people have been telling me, are we saying that we're weaker than them? Because that's what it seems like when people are like, no, we can't take them back. That's impossible. And it's like, well, they were able to take us over pretty quickly. Why can't we take them back? So, the way to do it is, first of all, don't run away. And also, don't be afraid to speak your mind and make a fuss. A big weakness for Christians, especially, white affluent Christians in mainline Protestant churches, is they're too polite. They don't want to start any conflict, so they will often, I'll often hear, when our pastor, our progressive interim pastor, preached something heretical, I would talk to a bunch of people and they'd be like, yeah, I didn't like that, but they wouldn't actually speak up and say anything, and that's the whole problem. A lot of us can be a bit too polite. Now, of course, it's a really fine line, because we're told to say everything that we believe with gentleness and respect. So we need to keep doing that no matter how bad our situation is. But that doesn't mean we be too shy to use our voice. So in your church, if you see the seeds of progressivism starting to be planted in your church, say something. Because generally the reason that progressives get their way is because they're the loudest. They're the most annoying. They make the most demands. It's like the squeakiest wheel gets the grease, or however the saying goes. Because they make the most demands and they're the least apologetic, they get their way the most. So I'd say the first piece of advice is don't run away. The second piece of advice is don't back down. But that's still a bit vague. The third piece of advice, and this is the harder one, is you will, especially if you're retaking a church that already is pretty deep in progressivism, you will have to sit through a lot of stuff you really hate. Now, progressives are stereotyped as being very sensitive, and that's true, but they are willing to sit through a lot of stuff they don't like in order to hijack it. And that's what the left is really good at doing. Like I always say, they don't actually create anything, they just hijack things. They don't create their own institutions. They just hijack institutions that Christians have made. Not just the churches, but think of all the Ivy League schools, which were founded by Bible-believing Christians and hijacked by leftists. So, we think they're so sensitive, but they had a lot of patience being willing to be in these environments they disagree with just so they could gradually crawl into a place of leadership so they could change it from the inside. So in order to actually change something that's not good, you need to tolerate a lot of what's not good so that you can become rooted in the community, so you can gradually, eventually, over time, have somewhat of an influence. And it will work. Because, trust me, mainline churches are desperate for membership and desperate for people who will be active in their community. So I'd say the fourth piece of advice is be active and passionate. Mainline churches are so dead that they're desperate for any kind of energy, no matter where it comes from. So if you come in and show your passion for Christ, even if they don't really agree with what you're saying, they will appreciate your energy. And that's what happened with me. I know I am the most theologically conservative one in my church, period. But people still sort of liked having me around and gave me positions like teaching Sunday school and being on the communications committee and running the church's social media because of the passion that I displayed, whereas most people in a mainline church, it's lukewarm, it's dead. So if you bring a kind of energy, kind of Christian energy, they will appreciate that, and that will allow you to gain more influence. And it will require you to put up with a lot of stuff you don't like, but I put up for 2 whole years with a female pastor preaching heresy regularly from the pulpit each week. And so if I can do that, so can you. Another thing I would say is you need to do it incrementally. This really needs to be our mission field. I've always said the mainline Protestant churches need to be our mission field. And when you're doing that, you can't just barge in and tell them everything they're doing wrong, because then they're just going to say, okay, we'd like you to please leave. If you want to have an influence in the community, You gotta start as, you know, peaceful and unconfrontational as possible, and then as you build more connections in the community, work your way up. So I would say, like, if there's a graph, when you're just starting out in a community, don't bother getting into arguments or discussions or challenging what they do. Just get more involved in the community. And once you do get involved, which in mainline churches, it doesn't take long to do because of how dead they are, that's when you can start spewing more of your opinions. And if you get on the board of on the session, you can become an elder, which again, in a mainline church that's desperate for leadership and membership, that's also not really hard to do. Once you do that, then you can really have an influence, and then you can actually change things. So it's like a lot of evangelicals have such a heart for doing missions, and they're like, I'm going to spend 20 years in the Central African Republic preaching to the pygmies and giving them Bibles, and that's great, by the way. I posted like a while ago saying, like, you know, maybe we should do fewer mission trips to Zimbabwe and more mission trips across the street to our local mainline church. And some people took that the wrong way, but maybe I sort of phrased that the wrong way. I'm not against foreign missions. I think they're very good. I don't think we should use them to neglect local missions, and I think a lot of evangelical churches do neglect local missions. Because local missions can be like harder, because it's like, it's one thing to go to like a new frontier, because then you feel like you're actually making progress. It can feel a lot more frustrating trying to evangelize to people across the street, but that's what the church is also called to do. And I think we especially need to evangelize to these churches that are about to die out and are desperate for any sort of renewal. So yeah, I think that's definitely very important, even if it's you know, more emotionally and mentally taxing for us to stay in a progressive church that we can't stand the preaching of. But yeah, being involved and getting involved is what we have to do. And again, I'm not trying to explain why we need to retake the churches, but if we do, then like once you tip the needle a little bit, it will start to accelerate, because what you really need to do is disturb the safe space. A lot of people in progressive churches are people who just hate conservative Christianity and want a place that's safe from conservative Christianity. They feel like threatened by conservative Christianity, and they want a place where they're safe from that. So if you can just add a little bit of conservatism to the church, it will quickly turn into a lot, because those who are progressive will just get uncomfortable and leave. That's what happens, because we basically need to make the process go in reverse. Because it used to be, once there was an ounce of progressivism, it made all the conservatives get triggered and run away, and then the church became completely progressive. I think we can make it go in reverse. Once we add an ounce of conservatism, those who were supposedly traumatized by conservative Christianity will just get triggered and leave and go somewhere else. One time I was in a Zoom call. My church, this was before we had our new permanent pastor, when our church was still kind of woke. It was a Zoom call. It was basically a Black Lives Matter class. And all I did was I went there and I spouted some theologically conservative opinions. I wasn't saying anything political. I was just saying, you know, this is not, Black Lives Matter movement is not the gospel. It's not what Christianity is about, and we should not be supporting it. And this one progressive lady just got so triggered by what I said. I wasn't trying to be offensive. I was just saying what I believe. But she got so triggered by what I said. She was like, I'm getting so much religious trauma from hearing this. I have to leave now. So, you know, I think we overestimate how strong they are and underestimate how strong we are. Because, you know, we always talk about, you know, how sensitive these woke SJWs are. So, if they really are that sensitive, which I think in certain circumstances they are, especially when they're looking for a safe space. Ooh, yes, diamonds. If that really is the case, then we should not be afraid of anything in trying to, hijack the churches they've taken from us. We should see it in some ways as, now, I want to be very careful saying this, because I don't want to be responsible for someone, like, causing a big, ugly scene at some church and conservative Christians being branded as assholes. So, only do this in a very incremental, polite, and loving Christian way. But we need to disturb their safe spaces. Like I said, progressive Christian churches have turned themselves into a safe space for those who hate conservative Christianity but just don't want to call themselves atheists yet. And that's why there are many progressive Christians in leadership at these churches. So, if we want to get them out of leadership, all we have to do is disturb their safe space, because then they won't want to be there anymore. Because you have to understand, progressive Christians don't care about religion. They really don't. They're only willing to be part of a religious community if it can be basically just like all their other woke progressive communities. And once it stops being like that, they're not going to want to be part of it anymore. So, if, like, the statistics show that conservatives are more likely to contribute to their local church than progressives. So if the progressives leave a church, it won't hurt the livelihood of a church at all. However, when a church becomes progressive, usually the conservatives leave, and that does hurt the livelihood of the church because conservatives are usually the ones contributing to the church. So yeah, I would say, just to recap my 5 points of advice to take back a progressive church. 1 is don't run away. If your church is beginning to fall to progressivism, don't run away. 2 is, I forget what order I said. I'll skip to number 3, which is you might have to put up with a lot of things that you don't like hearing, a lot of things that make you uncomfortable, but remember, we are stronger than the left. We can do what they can. Number 4 is get involved, because they are severely lacking energy and commitment. So if you bring that, you can rise up in power and influence pretty quickly. And number 5 is make sure to disturb their safe spaces, because then it will pretty easily fall back into our hands.